Dr. Gerald Brooks' Leadership Podcast is up next here on Cool 97.5. Partnership with Raul Quaresma Ministries and Cool 97.5, we gladly present to you Dr. Gerald Brooks' Leadership Podcast for pastors, leaders, and church workers who are involved in God's ministry every Wednesday from 12 to 12:30 high noon, only here on Cool 97.5.
Welcome to the Gerald Brooks Leadership Podcast, a deep dive into biblical leadership with pastor and author Dr. Gerald Brooks.
Hi, this is Gerald Brooks. Thank you for joining me for today's podcast. I want to talk to you about the temptations. Yeah, that sounds a little bit awkward, but the temptations. What I want to do is I want to walk you through a passage of scripture in Nehemiah chapter 5. We all know the background to this story. God has raised up Nehemiah out of nowhere to become the leader in the midst of an environment that Jerusalem is in. Its walls have been taken down, therefore it lacks all defense against any marauders or any robbers or any organization that wanted to come in. And so he's now taken on the task of rebuilding. But as the rebuilding begins to progress, he runs into some leadership problems. And the leadership problems are pretty common because they involve temptations. And it's the temptations that are around leaders all the time. It's the temptations that leaders can give into. And what the temptations do is they get us off target, they get us off task, and they cause us to do things that cause the end result to be less than what we want it to be. So I want to walk you through. The first one's in verse 7 of chapter 5, and he says, after serious thought. And let me just say to this, when you're dealing with other leaders, you need to think through what you're doing. You need to spend some time, because whenever you're dealing with other leaders, there is always a multiplication effect, because what you're saying to them is going to get distilled down to others. And so it says, after serious thought, he has thought this through. He said, I rebuked. And another thing that I love about this is that he didn't just go in and lose his temper. He really thought this through. And he says, hey, if I'm going to rebuke them, I need to know what I'm doing and I need to know why I'm doing. See, it seems like anger is the first measurement that people have in their life today. They immediately go from 0 to anger in literally 60 seconds. But I want you to know this man thought through what he was doing. He not only thought through, but as he thought through, he said, I need to challenge them. I need to confront them on some things. And he says, I rebuked the nobles and the rulers and said to them. Now, I want you to get the terminology. He talked to the nobles and rulers. These were people who held position in Israel. They held either position because they were in the right family, or they held position because they had some degree of authority. Nobles, right family, the idea of rulers having authority. So the first thing that we see is that when you have position, just position, it's easy to let your position begin to become a negative instead of a positive. I'm just a firm believer that if you need an organizational chart to lead, you're probably not a gifted leader. Because what I know is this: positional leadership is the lowest level of leadership that exists. See, positional leadership says basically this: you've got to follow me because. And leadership isn't to be a because issue, it's to be a choice issue. That people follow you because they choose, not because. And what had happened was there were people who had positions, and their position went to their head. So they thought higher about themselves than they really, really were. They thought more about themselves. If I can put it to you this way, position can cause you to take yourself too seriously. And probably the profound example of that is King Saul in the Old Testament. Remember what God said to King Saul? Remember when God wanted to appoint him king, he was hiding. He didn't want to be king. He was hiding behind basically a haystack, but then eventually had the position of king. And as he had the position of king, the position changed him. And God said to him at the end of his reign as king, he said, "You were great as long as you were small in your own sight." He had let position get the best of them. He had let position get the best of him. And so whenever you have to lead in a conversation and saying, "I am the boss," you're probably not leading well. Now, everyone may know you're the boss, but when you have to say you are the boss, and that's the authority of your leadership, you're losing. You're not doing something that's great. You're not doing something that's good. And see, positional leadership becomes dangerous when we take our position too seriously. And so, we have a thing on TV now called the undercover boss. And what is it? It's a boss who's high up in a company, and then he goes and he works at his own company, but he's in disguise, or she's in disguise. And what it does is it takes them out of their position and lets them see differently. If you didn't have a position, would you do what you're doing? Would you say what you're saying? Would you act how you're acting? See, if anything about your position will change what you're saying, what you're doing, and you're acting. And I get it that when you're in a position of leadership, there are things you have to do then that you wouldn't if you weren't in a position of leadership. But I'm talking more in the wider berth. If you were in a position where you did not have the position, how much would it change what you say and what you do? And if that is dramatic, I want to encourage you, you may need to look and say, have I given in to the temptation of position? Have I let my position become more meaningful to me than it should? Have I let my position become greater in its value to me than it should be? Have I held on to my position? See, in Christian circles, what I love is people hang on to titles. And I don't get it. Because titles need to be a reference point of God, not a reference point for us. So I have people visit my church and basically they'll say, well, I'm elder so-and-so, I'm elderess so-and-so. And I'm thinking, well, if you were an elder, you're at that church. Why are you at my church? But see, they left that church, but they held on to the position. And when you have to hold on to the position, you've built your identity on the wrong things. Do you see what the temptation is? When the position becomes our identity. I am the boss. And if you have to tell people the boss, you're probably not. When position is what drives your leadership, you probably need to take a step back. Now, how you handle position in leadership determines the motivation of your leadership. So how I handle position in leadership determines how I will handle the motivation of my leadership. Am I motivated because I'm the superintendent, or am I motivated because I'm overseeing something of value? Is the position what motivates me, or is the value and the vision what motivates me? So how you handle position determines the motivation of your leadership. The next thing is in verse 7, he says, according to our ability. According to our ability. This is the power of leadership. See, this goes beyond position. This is the power of leadership. There's a level of giftedness. There's a level of you're good at this. And see, there's a lot of people who have positions, but they're not good at anything. But power leadership, this person has some wherewithal to accomplish something and do something. And so there's a recognition factor. This individual is there. But the problem with power is that we need to be careful how we exude the power that we have. Let me build a bridge. I read about a study that was done, and it was basically wanting to see how people responded when they had control. So basically what happened was their finger was tied to a little, electrical line. When someone hit a button, a little electrical charge went. Now that electrical charge could go 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. And as it went up, the electrical charge was a little bit higher. Now, what they did is they set the electrical charge. And when they set it, they then said, okay, you're hooked up where you're going to send the electrical charge to someone else. And your job is to match the level of electricity that you receive to them. Do you know what they found? They found that people always up the electricity to the next person. Whatever they received, they upped the electricity. So what did they do? If they received an electrical shock of 1, they sent a 2 or 3 to the next person. Why? Because they perceived that they had received one thing, but then they reacted by being over the top towards the next person. And that's the thing. Power is never to be used to manipulate. Manipulation is for our benefit. Intimidate, where somehow we play the game of intimidation with someone, or to dictate. Power is never to be used for those 3 things, but yet it's common. Power is never so you look good, but rather so that God can be good to others. So any power that God gives me is so that He can be good to other people. And so if there is an ability in me, if there is a gift in me, if there is a power in me, it is so that others can receive the goodness of God. So when you're a leader, don't power up. When you're a leader, don't use power plays. Use your power to serve. Don't use it to promote. See, how you handle power determines the longevity of your leadership. See, if you're using it and you're powering up all the time, you're not going to lead long. But if you're using it to be a blessing, people are going to flock around you, and you are going to be their leader for a long, long time. So, the first temptation is the temptation of position. We take ourselves too seriously. The second temptation is the temptation of power, that we use it abusively. And so when you get the first one right, your motivation as a leader's right. When you get the second one right, you've created the environment for you to lead a long time. What I can say to you is the people who have the most power are seldom the people who lead the longest. It's the people who make wise use of power who lead the longest. The next one is privilege. And this is a little awkward for me because my whole view of leadership is when you become a leader, you lose the right to think about yourself. But I get it. In our society, literally, privilege is a part of leadership. Now, I say that to you that that's a little bit awkward to me, but yet at the same time, I realize that I have some privileges that other people don't have. But those privileges at times can become their own temptation. He says, and I also, this is in verse 10, with my brethren and with my servants am lending them money and grain. Now, he's talking about being privileged, that he has a few things others don't. Now, here's the thing. Whenever you have privilege, the most important skill that you need is the ability to say no to yourself. Before anyone else tells you no, can you say no to yourself? And you need to build into your life barricades, literally, and barriers that stop you from becoming overly aggressive with your privilege. Now, I get it. Everyone has their house rules, and I have no problem. And please don't let this illustration become anything other than just an illustration that you can relate to your life. But at the organization that I lead, I don't have a parking space. I park far away. I park far away and I walk close. Now, typically, in an organization like mine, I'd have a close parking space. And it would be designated for me and nobody else gets to park in it. But here's the thing. I don't have a parking space, not because I think having a parking space is wrong. It's just one of those little ways I say no to me. See, if you can't say no to a privilege, then privilege will get the best of you. I want you to understand that. If you can't say no to a privilege, then privilege will get the best of you. I remember when my son Cody, who many of you know because he's one of the most fantastic leaders and workers, Cody can literally answer 95% of every leadership question I'm ever asked, and he can answer it well. But I can remember when he was little and I needed a car, and he asked me what I wanted, and I told him. Well, I ended up getting that make of car, and I ended up getting that brand of car, but I didn't get the color that I wanted. And Cody asked me, he said, "Dad, why didn't you get the color you wanted?" And I told Cody, I said, "Cody, if you ever get everything you want, you get yourself in trouble." See, what I found is when a leader gets everything they want, they become a problem. So your ability to say no to you is critical. It's critical to healthy leadership. So privilege is never to be leveraged for personal benefit. What you can do is never what you should do. And "I deserve" is a dangerous phrase for a leader. The higher you go, the more you need to learn to say no to you. And how you handle the privilege determines the priorities of your leadership. Are you the priority, or are other people the priority? So, temptations. There's position, you take yourself seriously. There's power, you become abusive with it. There's privilege, you start expecting it, and you make you the object of your leadership. There's another one, and that is found in verse 15. "But the former governors who were before me laid burdens on the people." It says the former governors. Why were they former governors? See, here's what you learn. People want to be treated like leaders even when they no longer lead. But I have a simple phrase, and it's what I tell my people all the time. You can retire from a job. You do not get to retire from the will of God. But the reason they were former leaders is they were the ones that let the walls come down and didn't rebuild the walls when they had a chance to rebuild. And therefore, they had nothing to govern. But it says the people began to lay burdens on the people. These people, because of their past leadership, had more than most people had. They had more resources. They had more income. They had more. But when God gives you possessions, it's not so you can have more, it's so you can do more. That's what I pray for my people all the time. See, I grew up in a group that many times said this: God's going to bless you. But they forgot that the original verse on blessing is that God's going to bless you so that you can be a blessing. And a lot of people are very content with being blessed who've never been a blessing. So God blesses you because he's thinking of someone else. And if you're not thinking of someone else, your blessings are numbered. Yeah, you can count them day by day, but the amount of time you'll be blessed, you've limited. Because the key to being a blessing is that you know that when you're blessed, God wants to bless other people. So as you receive, it's so you can do more. And so I pray every time we take an offering, God, thank you for giving my people more, not so they have more, but so they can do more. Because I want to plant in them that when you get more, more comes with a responsibility. The more you have, the more responsible you are. So I literally pray, Lord, give them more, so they have more, so they can do more for you. It's like the hose. The hose doesn't hold on to the water unless there's a kink in it. That's someone who just wants to be blessed. The hose lets the water come, but it's always wet on the inside because it's always letting the water flow. When you become a blessing, you create an environment where others are blessed. How you handle possessions determines the maturity of your leadership. So in my organization, I want to be one of the top givers always. I want to lead in giving. I want to be one of the individuals that gives because if God's blessed me with more, it's so that I can do more. So I want you to get this. The temptations. Position. You take yourself seriously. Power. You exercise it in extreme ways. Privilege. You think you deserve it. And possessions. You start holding on to them. See, all of those are the temptations. As a leader, you cannot give in to any of them because there's something bigger than your position, something bigger than power, something bigger than privilege, and something bigger than possession. It's called people. And the more that you use leadership to help other people, the more your leadership will endure and the more your leadership will be solidified. People don't remember you because of the position you hold, the power you had, the privilege that you received, or the possessions that you kept. They remember people who helped them. As I like to tell people, there's a difference between prominence and power. If you go back to India, who was the prime minister when Mother Teresa was in Calcutta? The prime minister had all the power. Nobody remembers the prime minister of India. Everyone remembers Mother Teresa. Why? Because prominence happens when you help